So welcome to our 4 guests and welcome to our session on self-care and beyond. So I'm going to do a brief introduction to each of our guests, and you know, one or two people did send me bios, and even the bios that you sent me are going to be slightly shortened, mainly because I've discovered that on Zoom you can only have everything on one page, otherwise you get panicky. So I have to keep everything to one page. So everybody's bios are about 2 or 3 lines long. So first of all, if I just introduce you, and then if you just like to say hello to people so they know who it is. So first of all, Sheila Ghelani, and Sheila teaches, mentors, collaborates, co-creates, making lots of different types of work with lots of different kinds of people in lots of different kind of places, and not always with artists or people who are even interested in arts in particular. My particular interest is in hybridity and cross-pollination, which is informed by her own experience of being mixed heritage, Indian English, and the theme of care, which of course we're focusing on this morning. And you know, we have chosen people today who are engaged in some way with questions around care, either care, self-care in the sense of the artist, or care in terms of the wider community of artists who are working with them. So Sheila, if you'd just like to say a quick hello, that would be great. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Do you want me to say, I don't need to say anything else apart from hello, do I?
No, hello is totally fine.
Great.
So then, but you could say more if you want, if people can say more if they want. So secondly, I'm going to introduce Marcelo Sancheź-Camus, who's a creative practitioner, originally from Pinochet, Chile, but living in London, engaged with performance, installation and text, but with a special emphasis on much of his work in community well-being. And more recently, he co-founded the Social Art Network, which is another reason why we've got Marcelo with us today, which is really the main support system now for other artists working in this field. So Marcelo, if you'd just like to say hello.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. It's nice to see some familiar faces, and also to put some faces to names that I might have known your name but never seen you before. So hi, and we'll chat more in a bit.
Right, thank you. And thirdly, I'm going to introduce Ocean Cerini. And Ocean's practice is mainly around themes of class, value, home, and humor. And through a mashup of photography, clothes, and collage, she's seeking to question and offer an alternative to mainstream representations of what normal is, exploring ideas of identity, success, and in the context of care, looking at happiness. So if you'd like to say a quick hello, Ocean.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to do this. I feel like I haven't done like an artist thing with other people for so long, so super nice. Thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. It's just so wonderful to have you all here and to look, especially in this session, particularly, I think, at these issues of self-care, which have come up over the weeks, and which all of you have been thinking about in different ways. So I'm going to ask each of you in turn to tell us something about your practice, touching on the particular context of care, both of self and others. And I think I'll go in the order to begin with that I had on my list. So I'll begin with Sheila, if that's okay. And if everybody has about 3 or 4 minutes for each question, then I think we'll get through in the time. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, just tell me if I talk for too long. Yeah, so I would say I've always been interested in care from a thematic point of view initially. So like I made one of my first pieces of work was called Cover Me, Care for Me in 2007. That was one of my first solo pieces. And then I've always also been interested in hosting those who might encounter my work. So I've always been thinking about how to make the experience good for them, so taking care of audience. And I think that was in counterpoint to some of the companies that I was working with at the time that really wanted to challenge people. And so lastly, also in terms of context, so I've always been like literally looking for places of care where I can work. So just did a project with young carers with Heart of Glass. You'll often find me working with the elderly, or maybe in a psychiatric hospital, or with medical students through Performing Medicine, who I work with a lot. But then also in 2017, I had a project go slightly wrong. And as a result of that and all the feelings I had around that, I wrote a checklist of care for myself and then shared it. I was feeling isolated, scared, I was abroad, and the project was just, it just really went sideways. And I workshopped that checklist of care in a public forum, an artist sort of residency space. And there were members of public there and also artists, and you could basically pick a slot to have a massage or be sung to. And in return, then you would talk to me about the checklist of care. And all the artists that went through that, actually, they all were really deeply affected or cried. And so I really thought there's something quite massive there to think about in relation to the conditions that all artists are sort of operating under. So I wrote the checklist of care and shared it online, and it seems to have really resonated with people, and I can talk about that a bit more later. Is that about 3 to 4 minutes?
I think it was slightly under, but thank you so much for that introduction, Sheila.
Sorry, and, I'm so bad at judging time. I'm literally awful.
No, don't worry. I'll only stop people if we go miles over, so please don't feel pressurized with anybody. I won't even stop you. I just flag up that you might be coming to your end. And I think that checklist of care, if people haven't had a chance to look at it, has been so important and so useful. And Sheila and I have worked together, and I know that so many artists have found just having that something where someone's just spelled out some of the things that we all need to think about at different times. And it was so amazing that we took it from a project that went wrong, and yet you were so honest and shared it with people and allowed people to access your thoughts about how to make those things work better in the future. So Marcello, I know you haven't got a checklist, but I know it's something that you're constantly thinking about and writing about. So if you'd like to say something about your work in that context.
Hey everyone. I did make a couple of notes, and I am using a stopwatch to time myself because I often overtalk. So a few things just about my practice in general. I would say that it's one of the underlying aspects of all the work that I do is about community well-being, although I don't implicitly state it, because I think that often these questions and conversations around care and well-being can be really off-putting and can be frightening and can be seen as controlling and aggressive. So it's really interesting to think about the opposite effects of that. But I do think it's an underlying aspect of all my work, which predominantly finds itself in the crossroads of public art and social art through performance and installation. I worked as part of a therapeutic team at a large hospice on and off for a total of about 8 to 10 years. So that inadvertently made me an expert in the process of death and dying, which wasn't necessarily something that I intended specifically to go into. What that meant was that I understood the real importance of the differences between the creative art therapies and art as therapeutic interventions, and very much where I stood and why I wasn't a therapist, which was, again, a real kind of important boundary to underline and understand. Also, the differences between care when it comes to the biomedical and the psychosocial, and how, you know, our bodies and our minds, especially when you're dealing with something around such a big topic like death and dying. Surrounded in that was for adults. We did work with young people as well, but there's so much around there around care and vulnerability. Like Chrissie mentioned, I helped co-found Social Art Network. I'm part of the kind of caretaking group of it. It's that was really built up in its inception as part of a way of thinking about how we can have mutual support. And we kind of think of it as a mutual aid group. I'm still active working as part of what we have now, which is a kind of caretakers steering group. And there is about 10 sort of rep hubs around the country feeding into the conversation. And that really was an effort, much like this is right here, which is to pull people out of isolation, out of working silos, to have skill sharing, method sharing, and also a place to share challenges and very specifically kind of share failures so that we can learn from them. That's been growing, it's been developing, it's been a really big part of my practice, which has shifted into sector support for social practice. And then the last thing I'll talk about is a project that I worked on here with Sarah Lee, and who's in the room, and Lady Kid, which was developing a new role or testing out a new role as a well-being facilitator for a social practice project. This was for their project Enshrine. And so I took a lot of my learnings around care, around, I teach a course on health and well-being through art making at St. Martin's, and I brought it into trying to develop this role. A lot was learned from it. It was very successful, and I was really happy with that. And I've brought that finally into an AHRC fellowship I'm doing called Social Art for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, in which I've designed well-being sessions into the delivery of these 7 commissioned artists. And I don't think I will ever work again without designing that kind of space into work. And I'll pass that on. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Marcello, and thank you for introducing that sort of idea of mutual care. And it's something that's been coming up over the last couple of weeks, particularly when people were sharing their own work and thinking about how Faculty North begin to be a group of people who can support each other mutually, but also through, you know, other organizations like yours and like Migrants and Culture and things, but thinking about how we support each other and how we create that community of care around the work. So thank you very much. So Ocean, tell us a little bit about your work in that context. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're just saying about kind of the need for support for artists working, especially independently within kind of socially engaged stuff. Because when I did my residency in Fleetwood, which was kind of like a big, like working on my own thing for the first time, I've always like loved working in ideas around care, whether that be like care within family, that intimacy of family or friendships, or when you're working supporting someone. But then when I moved onto the estate, it became a whole different ball game, really, in terms of seeing how care was distributed on this kind of underground level within communities, and how there's like certain characters within those estates that cared for people, that they were like the people with the doors open who needed support. So actually, care became a massive part of my work, and a kind of realizing this kind of like non-transactional acts of humanity thing, and realizing, especially when I first started working in Fleetwood, I kind of threw myself into all the voluntary stuff that I could possibly find, just to know people and get to know the place. And that in itself became really the crux of the work, because there's this whole undercurrent of people, you know, volunteering and stuff, expecting nothing in return. But without this system of care, the world, the society wouldn't function without, you know, the people who work in the food banks, the soup kitchens, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, so that work in itself, and I think then that project became about doing justice to those people, making work with those people about that kind of non-transactional care, kind of like how important they are in the world, in society. So I kind of looking at care in the context of how important it is. And I think especially within families on those estates, a lot of like young parents, it was a kind of funny thing when I was living there, because, you know, I was to my 20s and a lot of the parents were in their 20s. So there was a really interesting relationship between us two, me and the parent, especially the mums, because we had different lives, and they really took me on and cared about me because I was living on my own on the estate. Yeah, so I think doing that kind of long-term work as well made me realise how isolating it can be and how much you actually need those people to make work with you to make this work, but you actually need them, as in like you need them to care about you too. That's how the whole thing works. So yeah.
Thank you, Ocean, and really interesting, that idea of the reciprocity of non-transactional care and the needs of the artist too. And I think when I was doing the interviews, Marcello was one of the people I interviewed, I did Sheila, but looking at, care for Heart of Glass and what was, the piece Care as a radical act, that actually, this is what Audre Lorde says, this is a radical act. We have to think about it in those terms. And it's not something that we just add on to our work in many ways. So to our next question, which I'll start with then Marcello this time, a career in the arts is precarious. We all know this. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've tried to put in place to help you, and if relevant others you work with or represent, to help navigate the precarious nature of this work? Thank you, Marcello.
It's quite a tricky question. I think there's a few ways that I begin from how I navigate it, because I can really only come from the place of my own personal lived experience and talk about my approach and ways of being. That hopefully could be useful. I think that the key thing for me has been to know how to live with little, and reduce, the conventional expectations of material wealth. Especially generational ones where maybe your parents or your grandparents might be on the property ladder and things like that, which for most people I know is just not possible, including myself. And thus kind of re-identifying what are your personal milestones for success. That takes a lot of reprogramming and can be really difficult because those milestones for success are conventions and they're handed down. And then we think that we need to achieve them in order to have felt like we're successful. Especially if you work in a kind of social art practice, we have different markers and milestones. And so understanding what those are and then feeling like you've really achieved is one of the ways that I feel like it becomes easier then to navigate the real cold hard reality of what it is to often struggle financially or struggle with validation, which are really difficult things. One of the things that I am personally very kind of boundaried on is paying a fair wage, paying my collaborators, and working to a fee. And this is something that I've really established as a way of working, even among mates who I'm helping them develop something. We offer each other exchanges. And it's not because we're trying to necessarily make money off of each other, but because it becomes a signposting of how we value each other and value ourselves. And again, whatever the amounts are that you might put on that are up to each individual, but they become a way of being able to navigate what is already the kind of precariousness of these positions and these times that we live in, and the critiques that there often is around how we may be valued, how we may be paid for our work, and how we may approach that with others when we don't have much to offer. So being really clear about that. I think the kind of balancing of your physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental health needs active tools. I'm a big fan of things like the Wheel of Life, Spidergram, mind mapping. They're things that I use in my well-being sessions. You're probably really familiar with them. Maybe you use them in workshops, but I think what we often don't do is use them on ourselves. I'm sure everyone here is used to running workshops, and I think what ends up happening is that we're really good at taking care of others and not so good at taking care of ourselves. And so knowing how to apply that to yourself is really important. And it's something that I often revisit, but I have to also shake myself out, and remind myself to sit down and treat myself as the subject of the workshop, not the facilitator. And one of the things that I learned very early on from somebody who was a partner of a friend of mine, very different person, not an artist. They were, you know, a successful corporate lawyer in New York City, lived such a different lifestyle, except that we kind of merged in certain aspects of where we hung out at the time. And they said to me, when you make your to-do list, make sure that on your list and not at the bottom are the things that you do for self-care. Don't make a work list and then make another list around the things that you need to do that day to just make sure that you're sane. Put them in your list and make sure they're up there at the top. I have never stopped doing that. And it's difficult because it means that I'm late for work. It means that I have to take this lunch break when I don't have time. It means that I have to do all these things that I don't want to do because I want to prioritize work, but I do it. And I cancel meetings and I'm late to things and I do it anyway. And as hard it is, I'm better for it. So that was just a tip that I learned that is really works for me. I'm gonna share a link here, and that's just a PDF that's up on the Social Art Network a page. It was a resource that we developed for, it's the last thing I'll say, for the Social Arts Summit, which was called the Sounding Board, Self-Care and the Sounding Board. So what are the different levels? You know, how do you begin with yourself? How do you begin with peers? Where do you find support? What is mentoring, coaching, therapy? What are the kind of different levels of things? Just knowing what the tools are out there seems to me really essential in order to begin to unpack them and use them. I'll pass that on.
Oh, thank you so much for that, and thank you for sharing that kit. You know, that idea of, you know, are we facilitator? Are we the subject? Are we the therapist? You know, what are we at those different moments, and how we're feeling that we need to be all of those things at all those times, as you say, often not thinking about, and on myself and how am I in that. So, Austin, I mean, you're talking about precariousness, and you're also talking about working with very precarious members of the community as well. So, you know, speak to us a little bit about how you found ways of dealing with that.
Yeah, totally. I think, especially when I started the residency, I kind of was like, right, I'm going in as an artist. That's what I am. That's what people see me as. But actually, you know, as quickly as I started, it was like, oh, I need to be a bit of a social worker. Oh, I could do with being a bit of a youth worker. Oh, I could do with being like all of these things, to the point where 3 months in, I was like, like, I don't even know what I am now, because I've lost myself within this, because I feel like I should be doing all of these other things at the same time. And I think, following on from what you said, it's kind of like prioritizing yourself as a person, you know, first and foremost as a person, then you're an artist, and then whatever that is after that. So I had a point to make as well. I'm trying to note. Yeah, and kind of like, because not putting too much pressure on the work in that sense either, because people see it on you that when can work with people, or when especially when you're starting something new, that you're trying to push it, or you're already burnt out from the idea of it, so it's really hard to even start. And I think sometimes you really want the work to happen quickly, especially when you've got a time scale with funding or whatever. It's like a big thing, but actually if you decide to take it slower, it actually happens in a much more meaningful way. And I think especially in terms of like self-care, and as is kind of like Rosalie was saying about this kind of act of collective change, really, to change the way we talk about that. When I was working with a group of 15-year-olds in Fleetwood, and we were like trying to start our own fashion streetwear label, it was actually really interesting, because I thought they were quite confident, but actually it turned out they valued themselves very little, especially within the context of the place they grew up, because it was a nowhere place. And I kind of, for me being like, was talking about that, and me obviously being outside of being 15, I've kind of done that bit, kind of made me realise that collectively we need to talk about kind of value of self, whether regardless of age, especially when you're growing up, it's really hard. And I think to talk about value of self through the work was the bit that kind of caught on, kind of like, oh yeah, actually we're just as cool, or we can make stuff that's just as good. as in London or whatever people, these brands make or whatever, like, it was only then that it caught on, like, oh, actually we have just as much value if we give about ourselves, basically. So that was really exciting, and especially in the context of working with young people. And that's another thing that I was going to touch on. Oh yeah, and also we did this thing where I did this thing throughout the residency. It was like called A Story of Change, and it was a kind of thing of like, so I could track the work and how the work was moving on. And I think the word change is like massive, because you want stuff to be moving on or changing really quickly, because we did it every 2 months. But actually, sometimes I realized I'd taken loads of steps back, and to look at that as a success as opposed to a failure of a project, that actually you've gone here and then that hasn't worked. But by realizing that that hasn't worked, you can go back to here and have a bit of a fresh look at it, to give some air around things, so that you're not suffocating the idea or the kind of creativeness around them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and of course that sort of whole idea of social change is going to happen, within a 6-week project is something that funders just love, isn't it? Somehow, and finding ways to be strong about dealing with that and talking about that, and accepting that that's not quite what's going to happen. But I think also importantly talking about, how we as artists can help people find the value of self in the work, that this is what we're doing, that we're co-creating work together. And finding that value of self seems really important. Yeah, I think all of you importantly, I've sort of so far, we'll speak to Sheila in a moment, bringing up that idea of solidarity, the idea of both solidarity and challenging the system, and then finding ways around the system in order to support each other in different ways. So Sheila, perhaps you'd like to say a little bit more about, the ways that you've coped with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the checklist of care, that was my attempt to try and deal with some of the precarious conditions surrounding practice. And what it does is it asks you a series of questions that you can, there's a series of questions that you can ask at the beginning of a project, and they take you through things to do with the self, through to flora and fauna, or also others, thinking about others. They're sort of like little prompts. But and also Rachel Dobbs from Low Profile turned it actually into a sort of an infographic and a poster that you can put up on your wall. And she didn't include everything that's in my list, but it's something that you can actually have on your wall. But I mean, I do use it, but it's super overwhelming as a list. I just want to sort of like emphasize that, and in a way, like, it actually shouldn't have to exist if these like conditions that were surrounding us were better. Institutions should care more for the freelancer. And I think the checklist of care was just like my realization that literally nobody does. It's gonna like, they're gonna eat you up. And so, yeah, have a read of that at some point, but also, I don't know, write your own version, I would say, and put it on your wall. But then some really practical things that I use to help me navigate the precarity is I'm in lots of artist groups, so self-led artist groups, like that are unfunded, that happen under the radar, and that are just like small kind of coalitions or groups of interested artists. I mean, a couple. And something that I noticed was that friends, I'm a member, like I'm an associate artist of lots of companies, so I sort of attach myself to other companies that seem to know how to navigate the system better than me. And I actually started to try and set up myself as a company, and then just like, it was not right, it was bad, it was badness. So I just retracted, and I much prefer being this sort of like free agent and accepting all the precarity that comes with that. So yeah, but there is something to investigate around that, because I think companies have structures around them. And I work collaboratively more often than not nowadays. because I think, again, there's strength and power in many. I had a producer for several years. I don't have one at the moment, and I haven't had one for a couple of years. And I can really feel that there's something about the energy of someone else who's sort of interested and wants to sort of, I don't know, to work alongside you and help you speak up. I guess sometimes that's something I find personally really hard. And again, just in terms of money, I actually really use the AN fee guide, and I quote it often because, like, I find it really difficult to ask for like real fees. I'm 47 years old, you know, and I've just sort of come to the point where I have to actually like value that, and it's really tricky. And I've also, another really practical thing that I've started to do after a project is over, and when I'm asked to sort of give the feedback, I actually try and often avoid giving feedback, avoid that moment, because I actually don't think often organisations do anything with a lot of that. But what I have made sure that I do is feedback on the extra hours that I've done, and so that they can see literally how much time I've spent on something. And it's quite interesting. It's super gentle. I do it really gently always, but it seems to be that it kind of seems to provoke quite a lot of discomfort. But I just think it's really important because, like, yeah, none of it's very realistic. So I would say those are some really practical things that I use to try and make myself feel less precarious.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, I think as all of you said in some way, you know, that precarity is partly chosen to be an artist working outside the system and outside the organizations, but then, you know, how through coalitions, through friendships within work, through finding those people that you can co-create in certain projects with, and finding those sort of ways of being a little system of your own somehow, whether it's a group of friends who pay each other fairly and things like that, the ways of finding ways to be both outside the system, but also to challenge the system through the way that you work. And I love your idea of putting down those extra hours. I just think it's a wonderful thing to do, to put down all those extra hours. And I love it also, Sheila, that you do it in a kind and gentle way. But yeah, to remind people of all that extra work that goes around things seems to be very important. So I know all of you have shared lots of sort of things already in the chat of websites and resources and things, but we've asked everybody who's come along to each of the sessions, you know, whether there are any other top tips that you would like to give about both self-care and beyond that, you know, whether you set yourself particular goals, whether you have a mantra, whether there's something important that you've read of somebody else's or watched or listened to that you think, yeah, everybody should know about this, or I'd like to share this. So maybe we could go around, you know, just sharing some tips, sharing some thoughts, sharing someone else that you've read or listened to or discovered on the way that you'd like to go forward and share with us. So I think I'm going around the circle, so I think it's Ocean maybe to begin with this question.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting thing in the sense of when you're working with people or when you first getting into projects and people speak about, oh, I want to give something back. And I always find I really hate that statement. I find like you should be very skeptical of people who say, oh, I just want to give something back. Like, so I was just thinking, what did you take in the first place? So I think that's another thing to be very wary of when you're meeting people or making work with people. It's kind of just scoping out who they are and what they're about before you start making work with them, because once you're in, it's really hard. So yeah, kind of getting to know, especially if you're collaborating or working with funders, kind of scoping out who they are first before you kind of go in. And also, I think there's a whole thing about like when you're making work or whatever that is you're doing and working with people, is we're all trying to create work that has long-lasting meaning, which is a really big thing to try and do. And I think you have to always start by seeking to be of service to yourself and the people that you are working with or seeking to represent, because that's what it's about, and that's what will give it the guts, is the fact that it's not about them, it's not for them, it's totally of service and is a continuation, a long-term continuation of something positive that you found or is wanting to progress. Obviously I've only learned that from getting it wrong a lot, but I think yeah, trying to make work or feel like you're making meaningful work that is does those people or yourself, whatever that thing is you're making, a justice, whether it takes forever or not. And it's not about the funder, it's not about even what the initial thing that they wanted is, because it's not actually about that, because it becomes something else. That's the whole point of making the work we make. Is like, yeah, no, we started with that, but actually this whole other things come out of it, because actually these people wanted to do this and this is what was meaningful to them, not that. Like, they don't want another mural, they've got murals, we've done that bit. Like, I think I love that. I met this guy once when I was working in Fleetwood, and he said, I was chatting to him just on the street, and he said, oh, so you're an artist then? He's like, you're a painter? And I was like, no, not really. That's not really. And he was like, you're not doing another mural, are you? And I was like, oh no, why? And he went, oh, because then everyone will know we're poor, like that. And I just was like, oh, that's like a lot. Like, and I always think about that, and I think about how this kind of like, I'm very wary now of when people talk about what this kind of co-creation with the people that you're working with, or that they've done a consultation and this is what people want, because they ain't done no consultation. Like, if you want to be something to be of meaning, I've learned that you have to do that bit. You have to do that bit to find out what people actually want, because the funders often so far out of it, it's like bizarre. So yeah, that's a big learning thing for me.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, not another mural ought to be a title for something, shouldn't it, in terms of this work, but also the importance that you gave to giving justice and value to the people and the work, not to what the funder suddenly imagines might be done, but how you do that through your work seems a really important tip. So Sheila, can I ask you to follow that up?
Yeah. So actually I've been trying to reconnect to what my goals are in the last couple of years. And I started to write a manifesto for making, and then decided that manifesto was just a really terrible word and not quite the right thing for me to be using. So sort of boiled it down. Again, that's on my blog, if you're interested to see that. But instead, what I decided was that I needed just a set of intentions. So I have boiled them down to like 5 intentions, which is rest, buy less, recycle ideas as well as stuff, work slow, and practice care. And they sound so simple, but they're really super hard. Like care, it's really hard to practice care, and it takes time. And the recycling ideas, like for me, we make so many projects that are just that just have like one outing or like a couple of outings, and it just seems really ridiculous. So like, I'm really absolutely into recycling old work and going back to stuff, and that's something that I've sort of discovered in the last couple of years. Like, it doesn't always have to be the new. So, and they're also to cultivate long relationships with venues, places, and people. So over really long cycles. So it might be over a cycle of 6 years, and it's easy for me to sort of say that, having now quite a long practice, so I can see those arcs. But just always, like, whoever you're working with, maybe there's the idea of a return at some point, because again, it's to do with recycling work and going deeper into sort of research and the layers that you pick up around a place or around people. And I have a couple of sentences like that. I always go back to an Annie Dillard quote, which is to do with, obviously, like, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. So I really try and remember that. So if, so a project, if it's feeling rotten, like how do you, this is your life. How do we try and sort of like spin that around? And also when I start to feel lost about like the efficacy of practice, I go back to a Kathy Acker quote, which is a series of invocations because nothing else works. And that's sort of a title that she had. She has Algeria at the front of that. But for me, something in that, when I start to like really question what I'm up to, there's something in that that really helps me. The idea of an invocation. So something that might be outside of capitalism or, it's just a really useful phrase. That's a kind of sentence that I've carried with me now, like for 15 years, and it really grounds me. So yeah, I would say those two.
Thank you so much for that. And the concept of an invocation, and an invocation being totally outside capitalism and the system that we've set up, I think is really powerful and important. And so moving on to you, Marcello.
Hey everyone, that was brilliant and sage advice coming from around the group, and lots of scribbling on my end. I made a couple of notes of things that I thought would be useful, and I think that I'm potentially maybe going to point away from myself and where I find kind of tips and advice moving forward. The first one is just a personal practice of mine, which is to really take time to research, read, learn, and reflect around the sector. And I think it's treating it as if it were like, some sort of school essay I had to write, that I had to go and learn about. Because I think the beauty and what I feel the absolute privilege of being part of a social arts sector is that it's this amorphic beast that sits at the current kind of movement of cultural democracy, and society is constantly evolving. Thus, there's no way to almost pinpoint what exactly is social art, because it's kind of evolving in the response to how society evolves. But in order to know what that is, you kind of have to stay current. And part of it is doing, but really part of it is taking a moment and step back from the doing to be reflexive, to be learning, to be reading what other people are putting out there. And I do every once in a while, I just take a step back from the doing and, like, what are the books I haven't read? Who are the people out there saying the right things? How can I then just take a moment to do that kind of research? So that really goes a long way to settling myself and understanding my own personal place. There's a couple of methods that I've used that I think are really useful. They might not work for you and you might hate them, or you might love them and they might be useful. I recently, over lockdown with a group of friends, rediscovered Julia Cameron's The Artist Way, which I had done when I was, much younger. Many of you might have done it, maybe you haven't done it. You kind of have to take it with a slight grain of salt, because it has a slight kind of like 12-step new agey aspect to it. There's a lot of like the G word in it. So if that puts you off, then just, the God word, then, just replace it with something else is all I'm saying. I found it super useful. The other one is The Four Agreements by Miguel Ruiz. I'm a huge fan of Miguel Ruiz. He's a shamanistic healer of the Toltec tradition in Mexico. The Four Agreements are mind-blowing. They're so simple. They're just really interesting principles that can really just help and guide and caretake. The other thing I wanted to just point to is readings that have really helped me around psychology. Specifically the works of J.L. Moreno. If you don't know, J.L. Moreno did amazing work around group dynamics. And we're somebody that really, our work is so much about group dynamics and just fantastic learnings around that. Carl Rogers, humanistic psychology around self-realization, just brilliant in order to help frame things. Again, this is part of that reflexive learning that just helps us bring some sort of thinking and philosophy into our work. Viktor Frankl, Search for Meaning, incredible, really just has helped me reframe things. I'll just drop that in here. He was a Holocaust survivor, and again, so much of what we do is around these topics, and I think can be really helpful. And then last piece of advice, and this was really sage advice that was given to me by what at the time I perceived to be an artist who was like much more successful and seemed to be doing quite well, while I was really struggling with whether or not I should just be even putting my energy into this, not only this type of work, but this type of lifestyle, which was really seeming to be incredibly detrimental to my life. And I was like, how did you do it? What did you do? And they just looked at me and were like, I have no idea. I was lost in a sandstorm for a big part of it. But the only piece of advice that I could give you is just never give up. That's it. I just never gave up. I never stopped doing what I was doing. It was so simple. And in my darkest moments, I really thought about it, and I thought, just don't give up. Just keep going. I know it's simple, but honestly, it's pulled me through some serious stuff. I'm very happy because here I am. I'm doing what I love. I feel incredibly blessed. There was definitely moments that I wanted to give up, and I didn't. So that's kind of my mantra that I pass on to the group.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Marcello. The only problem I find with that mantra of never give up is that I'm now 72 and not giving up. And sometimes I think, maybe I should give up, maybe I should just relax and just give it all up. But I think that was really, really important. And I also valued the importance you talked about bringing in the reflexive artist and thinking about, the connection with theory, because sometimes I think, having tried to run MAs and different kinds of artist learning in the UK, that, the Arts Council in particular and the system is a little bit interested in, not so interested in theory, that everything should be sort of slightly relaxed. The whole setting up the Arts Council was, I think they called it, it was a little half-cocked idea. We don't really sort of believe in thinking about things too much. And I think that's what always makes me think about the importance again is that lovely part of Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress, where she says, I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense, I couldn't go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing. And I think, for me, that really sort of sums up that idea that, yeah, we will find, if we read, if we look, if we consult others, that there are ways of understanding things. And you've also talked about things being systemic and solidarity and working across sectors. And I think for me, an important part of that is, thinking in that way. So our final question for you, because next week we are just going to go off and we're going to set up our own network or our own coalitions or our own sort of being together in different ways, having been part of Faculty North. We may meet up in the flesh, which would be really exciting, and I'm sure we'll invite speakers to come along to that if it finally happens. But one last thing, what have you learned from these recent times? Anything about network care, moving beyond just being an individual artist that you might share with us going forward?
So I think the one thing that has been really inspiring and a big learning aspect for me has been the rise of mutual aid groups over the last year, 2 years since the pandemic. It's so reflexive of the work that we do, and it's such a way of understanding how to braid in cultural production into the democratizing of social organizing. It's really powerful and moving away from government dependency. And mutual aid groups, they only exist in as much as you can give them. And this is really important. It's important for this group as Faculty of the North. It's important for the work that I've been doing around trying to kind of maintain and keep resilient the work of Social Art Network in terms of numbers, in terms of peer support, in terms of being able to understand what it is that we are doing to support each other. And sometimes that's not really clear. And sometimes we need direction and we need motivation. And I think I just wanted to put that out there because if we really start thinking about peer support, like this group, like Social Art Network, like Migrants in Culture, around mutual aid and what it is that we're all offering into those groups, and it could be a tiny little bit of something, it makes the groups incredibly resilient, and especially when those who really need the support from the group can step in to request and ask for that support, then suddenly there's lots of voices. I've seen it happen. I've helped set up a couple of mutual aid groups over the past 12 to 18 months, including, of course, Social Art Network, which is kind of a larger sector support. And I guess I want to mention, just considering this shift, not a phase, but a movement. This is a movement of practice, and I don't use that word lightly, and it's not something that I'm coming up with. I was really inspired to hear younger artists at some of our meetups talk about a movement of practice, and it made me feel incredibly happy and lucky to be part of a movement. And when we think of it that way, we have something that is really important in terms of thinking about mutual aid groups, which is power in numbers. Because one of the things that happens when we work in silos, when we work alone, when we don't connect with others, is that you lose your own personal power and autonomy. And that can really bring you down. And actually what these kind of mutual aid groups can do is remind you that there's so many people that have shared ethics and philosophies and are working together in very different ways, but across the country and the world. And that alignment is just so important to keep motivating you. And then the last thing about just learning from these recent times, and I'm talking now more generally around the sector of social practice, is creating new language, redefining terms, understanding what is our new vocabulary, what is our new shared vocabulary. I think this is something that is kind of become a new personal project of mine that I'm starting to send around Sam, partially through the work that I've been doing with Access, which is understanding what is our shared vocabulary. How can we send that around? How can we have this glossary of terms? How can we be always changing, always evergreen? And how can that do really radical things like redefine big keywords in the arts like aesthetics and value? And when we redefine those, we reappropriate them, and then we own them, and we move them away from things like the market value of the capital system in which the arts are entrenched, and which make absolutely no sense to us. And we know that, but we have to then create this whole other reality with our own terms and our own definitions as we abandon the past. And so all of that is part of like a really big inspiring aspect of learning that has come my way.
Thank you. Different big things, movements and changing the whole vocabulary. And yeah, the importance of us actually beginning to do that and challenge those things. And the importance of, yeah, the mutual aid, I think, has enabled people to see the importance of being part of a movement, and that maybe this work needs all of us to feel of ourselves as part of a movement that has its own vocabulary, that has its own way of describing these things, and is able to do that. So Sheila, and then.
So again, I was reminded of how important a collaboration was. So very important collaboration that I have with one other artist, which was really key for me. But also an artist group that I'm really, that I'm part of. It's seriously helped me through the last couple of years or year and a half. And there's nothing remarkable about it. It was just a group of 5 of us. And all we do in terms of the structure is each have 10 minutes to talk and then 10 minutes to offer back reflections, etc. But there was just something really important about that particular space. And I think it relates to listening and to being attentive, which I think is something that we really, I would say that's what we have to, that's one word that I'm carrying forward at the moment, be attentive. I feel like there's lots of, the culture war is real. There's so much basically, and we've just got to look out for those people on the edges, the invisible, the overlooked, the purposefully locked out, which, it does include artists, but there's others worse off. So I would say we need to practice attentiveness all the time. And another thing that I was reminded of was I became aware of the networks I wasn't in. So for instance, there was like the freelance task force, which I actually only heard of afterwards. And I think there's something to learn about, like, that's something that I really learned, I guess, over the last year and a half, along with being reminded of the precarity of everything. I was reminded and think that we need to take forward like the why of why we're making work. And I'm sure that's something that, like, I know that that'll be something that you're already thinking about. There's something to do with, again, the fact that care is hard work. So it's like we've got to roll our sleeves up and dig in, I suppose. And that, like, coming back to the collaboration with Sue, like, that's just been so extraordinary and such an important kind of regular point of contact for me. But even that, interestingly, like, we're doing a book, and Sue was being really mindful, and like, I'm really slow. You can probably tell from the pace that I talk at. I'm like a slow person, and she was sort of being really mindful and letting us go slow. And then it just came to a point where she was like, no, I need this done. So I had to speed up. So yes, it's a conversation. It's a conversation as well. Like, there's something to do with that. So, and I just was reminded how hard it is to take care for each other and be gentle. So yeah, and to think about the story that you're telling with your work, because we can see how powerful stories are at the moment. The government's sort of spinning incredible, like, stories. And so, like, I think there's something to do with that we have to really think about as well and carry forward. So nothing hugely revolutionary there, but like just lots of the same thing, I suppose, that others have been saying.
Yeah, but important things about listening and attentiveness, and that it's a conversation, I think, is really, really important in keeping that conversation going and allowing space for other people to, have that dialogue, have that conversation. So thank you for that. And Ocean, your final thoughts for us? Thank you.
Yeah, I think really just carrying on from everything you guys have been saying, and I think as well in terms of like researching or staying current, or theory even, I think sometimes you can think you're researching or trying to just make sure you're on top of everything, but actually you're looking at other people's work and feeling like you're not doing stuff and they are. And I think I really hate, the whole thing of competition within artists is just crap anyway, but like really checking yourself that you don't feel like that when you're looking at other people's work. You take the good from it, you think about what you're doing, you don't then need to start a project tomorrow. It's fine just to look at someone's work and think that's great. It's not about you. You can just look at it as a person and not just as an artist all the time. I find that like a really big thing, especially because it's so easy to do that now. I've had so much time to do that. And I also think we're in actually quite a revolutionary time to change the context in which work is seen. I mean, you know, all this time of galleries not being open or conventional places of seeing work not being open, this is like massive. This has like never happened before. So the fact that we can now think about what context do we and the people we make work with want their work, this stuff we make or do, to be seen in, or maybe the process is now the work in the bigger sense of being that is the work, and people seeing the process, or the audience or whatever seeing the process is the work now. And I don't mean that like, I think that's the whole thing of being like, oh, okay, like, we're revolutionary time, right? Okay, we start tomorrow. I need to think of some ideas. I mean, like, it is revolutionary, but like this is going to go on, so we've got time. So like, you know, I just think that's something I've been thinking about loads. In terms of that. And also I've found that collaborating, like everyone said, is like a massively important thing, but also this kind of thing of being like, I'm a full-time artist, because most people I know who were or thought of themselves as full-time artists before this pandemic or whatever are now not that. And I think it's a big thing that they kind of, it's a big failure on themselves, and I'm not that at the minute. Do you know what I mean? Like, and actually it's not, you know, you are who you know you are. Like, if you feel like an artist, you're an artist. That's great. You don't have to feel like be defined by that thing you now do as your full-time income or whatever that is. And I think that's really important, especially when you're making work with people who don't see themselves as artists or whatever that is. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that was my big thing.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for those final thoughts. And yeah, I love that idea, that lovely tension between we're in a revolutionary time, but you know, it's a long struggle, as Angela Davis keeps reminding us. It's a long struggle. It's a constant struggle. But yeah, let's struggle together against these things and work together as artists.